This video explains truth in terms of absolute and relative truth. We use the analysis of the living being as described by Martinus to illustrate the difference between an absolute and a relative truth. We get to see that both truths exist as complementary to each other. They are both necessary for the existence of a living being. We will understand that a relative starting point for an analysis results in a relative truth. Starting from an absolute fixed point will give an absolute truth. This video explains how we get to these two types of truth and their relationship to each other. The analysis of the living being and the view in this video is based on the work of the Danish author Martinus. Please comment and ask questions below, and I'll be happy to answer. If you're open to the idea that could be an actual truth, then subscribe to this channel. This channel is a journey towards understanding whether there is a truth and what it is. But do we even have something that we can consider a truth? The next section of this video goes into the analysis of the living being, which I think we need to consider at least from an analytical standpoint. So let's get into it. The analysis of the living being by Martinus is something I find hard not to see as a truth, at least from an analytical point of view. I will use this to illustrate the absolute and the relative truth. But let's start by getting to know what the analysis of the living being is. Martinus analyzed the living being into three sub-analyses. That is the I, the ability to create, and the created. The created is the moving part. It is what we perceive. This is what is changing. The second analysis of the living is the ability to create. This is the ability to change the created and is not part of the created. Something directs the creation and the ability to create. That is what we know as the I. The I is setting the direction in life. To be alive, you only need these three things. The I, the power to create, and what is created. These three principles, the I, the ability to create, and the created, makes up what is absolutely needed to have a living being. I will provide an argument for this in the next section, so it becomes more than just a pretense. Whether it's science or not, based on those arguments, is a huge discussion. Feel free to leave a comment about it, and I'll be happy to answer questions about whether this is science or not. But let me give you my view in the next section. My view is that the analysis becomes science and not a faith or belief when there comes logic and arguments into it. So let's take a look at the analysis of the living being. We do this by showing that if we take away one of the three principles, then there's nothing left. There's only absolute silence or nothingness. If we take away the I, then there's nothing to set direction for the ability to create and the created. Keep in mind that the three analyses are distinct. For instance, the ability to create is the only way to create. If you take away the ability to create from the living being, then you take away all the ability to create. It cannot happen in some random way based on who knows what. That is the assumption or starting point for the thinking here. So without the I, there is nothing to set direction in the living being. There is no will, which has to be there to have a living being. And without the I, there is no living being. The ability to create goes in a similar manner. If you have an I and the created, that is the living being without the ability to create, then there is nothing to change the created with. The I can set a direction and it has something that can be changed, but it lacks the ability to create. Thus, there is no change. Change is the sign of life, so with no change, then there is no life and a living being. Again, the living being needs the ability to create to be a living being. Finally, if we take away the created, then we have an I to set direction and the ability to create to change or manifest that direction. But there's nothing that can be changed. Thus, there is nothing to change and no change. Again, no life will exist without the created. Only an absolute silence will be there. To me, this is at least an analytical truth. The analysis does not make it a real thing. We need to match this up with our experience in our life to bring it from theory to practice. We need to understand what the I, the ability to create, and the created consist of. A materialistic point of view would make the I and the ability to create part of the created. Our consciousness is a product of our brain. It is part of the created. The spiritual science would state that the I and the ability to create are not a product of the brain. It is something that is above or behind the physical presence of a living being. There is something behind our physical world. This is the I, which has the status of something that is, and a mental or spiritual world which makes up our consciousness or mental part of us. We'll look into the materialistic and spiritual views in the next two sections, with an outset in the I. The I can be thought of as being either something that is or something that is created. We start with the something created view, which is a relative view and the one we are most used to. Something relative is something that is related to something else. That is, if something is relative to something else, it means it's changing depending on this other thing. The point here is that what the relative is based on can change. That means that in a relative analysis, both the perceived and the perceiver are changing. That is, the perceived is relative to the perceiver. If the perceiver changes, the perception will change as well. We don't have a fixed point to measure what is perceived. If we see ourselves as a physical body, our perception is relative to that view. We have a relative view on what we are perceiving. Our physical view on a thing is relative because this view is dependent on the senses that is perceiving. The colors and sounds, smells, and etc. are perceived through our senses, and our senses are changing, so our view is changing as well. The physical view we have is temporary. It is timely because it will change and is changing. This drawing shows the viewer to the left and what is viewed to the right. The figure in the middle is the view the viewer has on the viewed thing. We know that the view on the viewed thing will change when the viewed thing changes. But when the viewer changes, the view changes as well. So the view is relative to the viewer. We see the analysis of the living being based on a relative view. It has the I as a relative point. But what if we have an absolute fixed point? If we have a fixed point where things are viewed from. So what is a view from something that is absolute? Here we have the same figure as with relative, but the viewer is absolute. The viewer is not changing and cannot be affected by the view or the viewed. The viewer is above the view and the viewed, i.e. the ability to create and the created. In this case, the view on the view is not changing due to the viewer. Thus, the view of the viewed is fixed or absolute. The something we use to measure is fixed. We have a fixed point to measure what we view. This something cannot be changing because then it would be a timely thing and be relative. Thus, it is above what is changing, and as Martinus coins it, it can only be expressed as something there is. Martinus explains that this something is what we know as our I, and that is behind what is created or changing. The view as an absolute fixed point is an absolute or non-changing analysis of the I. If we named it big or small, lovely or hateful, then it would be a timely view. It would not be an absolute, but a relative description of the I. The absolute is independent, so nothing is affecting it. It cannot come out of nothing, so it must have always been there, and thereby the absolute is eternal. I have made a video about the eternal that is linked in the description and has a link on the screen. With a relative view, the realities become relative. But that also means it is possible to change. Life is change, so to have life to exist, we need change and the relative view. There's nothing wrong with the relative view. But we need to be aware that we are seeing the world from a relative and not an absolute perspective. So what happens if we have a relative truth? With the relative truth, we get a truth that is relative to something else. It will, by definition, be a changing truth. It will be timely. Something timely or temporary is a non-eternal truth. Relative analysis is necessary, but it's crucial to know the specific type of analysis that we are using. It can be a problem if we think of relative analysis as an absolute truth. Then we'll be looking for an absolute truth in an area where it doesn't exist. This area is the relative or created part of life. It's all the movement and changes in life. It's important that we have knowledge about the change in life. It is the main part of today's science. But it won't give us an absolute truth, because it's not in the changing part of existence where we can find the absolute truth. Knowing we're dealing with a relative analysis, is a way to be humble about our knowledge and what we know and don't know. So how do we come to an absolute truth if it's not in the changing or relative world? The analysis of the living being is an absolute truth in the sense that it does not change. We need the I, the ability to create, and the created to have a living being. This doesn't change. It is an absolute truth. The expression of the things the living being creates changes all the time and is a relative truth. We need both the relative and the absolute truth. An absolute truth will be independent of other things, or else it would be relative. Something that is independent of other things will not be affected by other things. Something that is not affected by other things is not changing. Something that is not changing in absolute terms has always been the same. Something that has always been the same is something we know as eternal. So the absolute and the eternal truth is the same. The difference between the relative truth and the absolute truth is that the relative truth is temporary and the absolute truth is eternal. The absolute truth has not started and will not end. The relative truth changes depending on how it is observed. The relative truth changes, but the relative truth does exist. It is just always changing. So it is an absolute truth that there is a relative truth. The fact that there is a relative truth is always true. So that view is absolute. There are not sometimes where we have a relative truth and sometimes where we don't. The relative truth is always existing. How the relative truth is expressed and perceived is, however, changing and relative. The concrete manifestation of the relative truth is relative, but the existence of the relative truth is an absolute truth. It should be said that the perception of an absolute truth can change, but the absolute truth itself is not changing. This shows that the perception of the absolute truth is not the absolute truth itself, but a view of the truth. The view of the truth is relative to the perceiver. It can be a more or less correct reflection of the absolute truth. That is, the perception can be closer or far away from the truth. This is why we can have more or less knowledge about the absolute truth. The absolute truth is eternal and has always been. The relative truth is changing, and the specific relative truth has a start and an end. So the absolute truth comes both before and after the relative truth. Thus, the absolute truth is above the relative truth. Absolute truth is the foundation for the relative truth. So why should we care about all this talk about relative and absolute truth? Martinus states that we can only establish a peaceful world culture if we have a common understanding based on the actual truth, a truth that involves both the relative and the absolute truth. So it is important to understand the difference between relative truth and absolute truth. The relative truth is based on the eye of the beholder. It is the fundamentally different views on the world that we have that causes our problems. Martinus explains that we will develop as living beings and come to an understanding of the absolute truth. Thereby will our differences be resolved. Because we won't have a fundamental difference, we will have the same similar basic understanding of life. We don't normally discuss what 2 plus 2 is. If we have the same type of basic understanding of life as we do with 2 plus 2, then there would be less to fight about and we would have a more peaceful world. That doesn't mean that we cannot be different. We can be very different even though we agree that we have something called day and night or 2 plus 2. There's a lot of room for differences between people with a similar understanding of life. So this is why absolute and relative truth is not just something of theoretical interest. If we get the fundamental understanding in life right, then we can start to better understand each other. We can be more tolerant, which brings more peace and harmony. That is the motivation for understanding these things. It addresses the question that people are starting to ask more and more. So what is the meaning of life? Is it possible to answer this in absolute terms so it isn't depending on who you are? This video aimed to establish a notion that there can be an absolute truth and what is the characteristic of this absolute truth. So if you want to hear more about the big questions in life, philosophical questions, Martinus' work, and so forth, please subscribe to the channel. Thank you, and thank you for watching.